The Sinking of the Titanic, 1912. The luxury British passenger liner RMS Titanic began construction on March 31, 1909 in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and was completed 3 years later in 1912. As one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, it was designed to be the largest luxury passenger ship in the world and would cost $7.5 million to build. It had a length of 882 feet 9 inches, or 269.1 meters, a height of 175 feet, or 53.3 meters, and a width of 92 feet 6 inches, or 28 meters, and it weighed 46,328 tons. Below the waterline was the orlop decks for cargo, and the tank top where the engines, boilers, turbines, and electrical generators were. At the very top was the boat deck, where the bridge and wheelhouse were, as well as the lifeboats. In between were the decks for passengers with first, second, and third-class cabins. The level of luxury was so high that second class was comparable to first class on any other ship. The 2,240 passengers would be from all walks of life, from millionaires and celebrities to poor immigrants looking for a better life in America. The ship would act like a floating hotel, featuring a grand staircase which allowed first-class passengers to move from deck to deck, and had a domed skylight to allow natural light in. The ship also featured a gymnasium, dining saloons, a reading room, a barber shop, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a swimming pool. The ship carried 20 out of a possible 64 lifeboats. Therefore, there were only enough for half the ship's population. However, this was within legal requirements. Lifeboats were only intended for carrying passengers to rescue ships and not keep the entire ship population afloat. As a result, the company who owned the Titanic, White Star Line, felt complacent enough to keep the number of lifeboats low so the deck wasn't cluttered. Many claimed the Titanic was unsinkable because its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. It was said that if up to 4 of these flooded, the ship would still stay buoyant. All of these qualities drew the press to frequently talk about the new passenger liner. Disaster. In the morning of April 10, 1912, passengers began boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England, with large crowds gathering to watch the ship depart. At noon, the Titanic set sail under command of Captain Edward Smith, beginning her maiden voyage. It would stop at Cherbourg, France, and then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more passengers, and then began its journey across the North Atlantic Ocean towards New York City. On April 14, 1912, warnings were coming in of icebergs from other liners, so Captain Smith had plotted a new course and continued to steam at full speed, which was standard practice. As it became dark, the temperatures were dropping to below freezing, and there was no moonlight or waves, making it difficult to see approaching icebergs. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the ship's lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg from the crow's nest. He rang the warning bell and telephoned the officers at the ship's bridge, shouting, "Iceberg right ahead!" Fleet had spotted the iceberg with his eyes, as the crow's nest binoculars were locked away. The key's owner, Officer David Blair, had been removed from the Titanic's crew at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key. The officers on the bridge quickly turned the ship away from the iceberg, but it was too late. The Titanic grazed the iceberg along its side, ripping several holes in its hull below the waterline, with fragments of ice hitting the deck. At first, everyone felt relief. The lookouts and the passengers didn't even feel the collision. 11:50 p.m. Captain Smith and the ship architect, Thomas Andrews, went to inspect the damage. They knew the ship would start sinking, and by this time, 6 of the watertight compartments at the front of the ship's hull were already breached and began flooding. 12 a.m. The captain sent out a distress call over the radio in the hopes that there were other ships nearby, and gave the order for the Titanic's passengers to board the lifeboats. He knew there were only enough for half the population of the Titanic. At 12:25, the lifeboats began their loading, with women and children first, as this was the protocol at sea. Many passengers still did not understand what was going on, and confusion and disorganization meant that the first lifeboat to leave had only 28 women and children aboard, when it could carry 65 people. First Officer Murdoch took the order to mean women and children first, then men if they were there. while Second Officer Light-Toller took it to mean women and children only. The Carpathia, which was 58 miles away, heard the distress call and began sailing towards the sinking Titanic to rescue the passengers. Distress flares were shot into the sky to help locate the sinking Titanic. By 1 a.m., with the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the water's surface. Water was pouring in 15 times faster than it could be pumped out, which was not helped by the fact that many of the passengers had left their portholes open. The unsupported stern and its propellers rose out of the water into the air. Panic and chaos set in as lifeboats were running out. Some people pushed their way to the lifeboats, while others accepted their fate and stayed behind or gave up their spots to more vulnerable passengers. Many did not want to survive the disaster and be branded a coward back home. By 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat had left, but 1,500 people were left on the ship. The deck was now at a steep height, and many passengers fell into the freezing, icy waters. At 2:17 a.m., the captain announced, "Every man for himself." The stern gave way under the pressure and broke off, with the front half disappearing to the bottom of the ocean. At some point, Captain Smith went down with the ship, a maritime tradition that the captain would do in accepting responsibility for all on board. Some say he went to the wheelhouse and waited for the end, while others say he committed suicide using a pistol. The stern, smashing into the water's surface, became level and soon started to fill with water, sinking nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean. Many died as a result of drowning, but the main cause of death was hypothermia in the freezing waters, which occurred within minutes. Some of the lifeboats returned, but only 4 survivors were found. At 3:30 a.m., the distress flares from the Titanic were spotted by the Carpathia. The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m. and picked up the lifeboats. Only 705 passengers would survive the disaster, with over 1,500 people losing their lives. What happened to the only Japanese passenger on the Titanic? Masabumi Hosono was the only Japanese passenger on the RMS Titanic. As a civil servant working for the Japanese Ministry of Transport, he researched Imperial Russia's railway system in 1910. His journey back to Japan then took him to Britain. After staying in London for a time, he went to Southampton, where he boarded the RMS Titanic on April 10, 1912, in second class. During the disaster, as the ship was sinking after hitting an iceberg, passengers began boarding the few lifeboats to evacuate. Hosono was asleep when the crash happened, but awoke when a stewardess knocked on his cabin and told him to put on a life jacket. When he tried to go to the top deck where the lifeboats were, he was blocked by a crewman who assumed he was a third-class passenger. But eventually, he slipped past and reached the top deck. All the while, flares signaling emergency were being shot into the air ceaselessly, and hideous blue flashes and noises were simply terrifying. Somehow, I could in no way dispel the feeling of utter dread and desolation, Hosono wrote. He found a lifeboat when an officer shouted, "Room for 2 more," and survived the Titanic disaster. When he returned to Japan, Hosono, instead of being cheered, was disgraced by the US and Japanese press because he did not adhere to the women and children first rule. He was fired from his job and portrayed in the media as a dishonorable coward who pushed other passengers out of the way to reach the lifeboat seats. Some newspapers even wrote stories about Hosono disguising himself as a woman to get on a lifeboat and said that he should commit suicide. He would be ostracized for the rest of his life in Japan in what is known as murahachibu, something which is still found today, where a co-worker who has made a grievous error or shown a lack of loyalty is avoided by his or her peers. Hosono died of natural causes on March 14, 1939, at 68 years old. After his death, his granddaughter found his diary and published it. In it, he said how he did not want to do anything disgraceful as a Japanese, which is seen as his redemption, bringing honor back to the Hosono family. The Titanic's violinists. The Titanic even had its own 8-piece band, led by 33-year-old Englishman Wallace H. Hartley, a professional musician who didn't actually work directly for the ship's owners, but instead worked for an agency who supplied players to the White Star Line Company's fleet of passenger liners. He had previously served on the prestigious RMS Lucania shortly before it was scrapped in 1909, as well as the distinguished RMS Lusitania, which years later was sunk during World War I by a German U-boat with a heavy loss of life. In 1912, Hartley had taken up the job as bandmaster for the RMS Titanic's maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. He was hoping that if he was himself noticed by the wealthy clientele on the Titanic, it could lead to some additional bookings in the future, as Hartley needed to earn some extra money as he had just got engaged. The band's wages were very low. They were actually reduced from the normal rate to only £4 per month by the agency that employed them, and they didn't enjoy many privileges. They worked long hours, typically from 8 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock in the evening. And although booked as second-class passengers, they were only given third-class cabin accommodation. On the night of April 14, 1912, just 4 days after the Titanic had set off on its maiden voyage from the English port of Southampton, the ship struck an iceberg off the coast of southeast Canada and sank in less than 3 hours, with a loss of over 1,500 lives. The Titanic carried only 20 out of a possible 48 lifeboats on its maiden voyage, as maritime safety regulations at the time stated that they only had to carry enough boats for a third of the ship's total human capacity. Even with a lack of lifeboats, a lot of them were lowered into the sea only half full. It is said that Wallace and his band members gallantly stayed on the deck, playing non-stop music right to the very end in order to avoid panic among the many scared and bewildered passengers still on board the sinking vessel. The band consisted of 3 violinists, 3 cellists, 1 double bassist, and 1 pianist. Some survivors of the tragedy claim that the last tune they heard the band playing on the deck was the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee." All 8 members of the band were drowned in the tragedy, and Hartley's body was recovered 2 weeks later by a deep-sea cable repair ship. He still had his life jacket on, and tightly strapped to his body was his instrument case containing his beloved violin. He was given a hero's funeral back in England at his hometown of Colne in Lancashire. It's estimated that around 40,000 people lined the route of the funeral procession to pay their last respects to Hartley. A memorial and bust were erected in Colne in 1915 in his memory and in recognition of his bravery. His violin was given to his fiancée, and when she died in 1939, it was donated to a charity. It remained lost and forgotten about until in 2006 it was discovered in someone's attic. Once it had been identified and its provenance confirmed, it went on to sell at auction in 2013 for a staggering $1.7 million. 2 hours after the Titanic had sunk to the bottom of the sea, the RMS Carpathia arrived on the scene and rescued 710 survivors out of the water. Some people narrowly avoided embarking on the maiden voyage. Among these were the members of the London Symphony Orchestra, who were booked on the trip for a 3-week tour of the US and Canada, but who had rescheduled their voyage and had gone on the SS Baltic a week earlier instead. 4 crew members also had a lucky escape because they had been drinking in the Grapes pub in Southampton and failed to board the Titanic in time for its departure. The last survivor of the sinking was Milvina Dean, who died in 2009. She was only 9 weeks old when she was rescued.
We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Compiègne, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon. History is epic. Watch it uncensored.